I paint a lot of trees, both for digital paintings but also for game art. And in this video, we're going to create some stylized trees to be used as game assets in a 2D game. We're going to draw these trees. More than that, I want us to discuss the purpose the tree asset is serving and how that affects how the asset will look. And then we're going to talk about the differences between them. We're going to talk about it in terms of repeated trees, centerpieces, platforming trees, and silhouettes. So what do I mean with centerpieces? Much like a centerpiece on a table, I think we can view this sort of as a tree that looks cool, but is not repeatable, and it demands a lot of attention. Essentially, the goal of this tree is to be eye-catching, so you could easily have too much of it. Broadly speaking, we can do this two ways. The first is to make the silhouette a really cool and unique shape. So I think we should try and draw a small wavy tree. We make the silhouette. We separate the tree from the leaves and the base, and now we alpha lock our layer. This makes it so we can only paint where we've already painted before. Then we shade a bit, both shadows and lighter parts. And now we make some line art. In my previous video, I started with the line art and then filled in the color. But here I'm doing the opposite. Why? Both now and in that video, I stressed the importance of the overall shape we were trying to produce. Whether you want to create that shape with a color or using line art is up to you. Both work. Once we have this shape, we drop a base color straight onto the leaves and the tree. Immediately after having done this, I shift the color a bit just to get a bit more color variation. And with this color, I start to create some texture. We finish polishing and take a look at this tree, and it looks kind of nice. Let's put it in a scene and see what happens. If the tree is alone, it kind of works. The shape is unique and the characteristics of the tree is unique. But if we try to repeat it, we get this weird wavy mess. This tree might be cool, but it can often be difficult to use more than once. So in general, when we create tree assets, we will want to make trees explicitly made to be repeated. They are there to help make your environment interesting and don't demand attention themselves. So let's try and draw a repeatable tree asset. We draw a tubular shape, sprawl some shapes that we imagine will be branches, then at the crown of the tree we just make lots of round balls. This is one of the main aspects of this type of tree. The shape is moderately simple and quite symmetrical around the y-axis, so we can repeat it. We're going to go into how to texture trees soon, but if we just finish rendering it quickly, we can look at the second aspect that can often break repeatability in an asset. This thing. If we try and place copies of this tree in a scene, we can see that this big hole in the tree essentially makes it obvious that it's a repeated asset. And if we remove this hole, it looks much better. Ideally, we should shift the top part of this as well to make it blend in even more. Or an even simpler approach is to make a copy of this asset, change just the top, and then have both of them to make them even more repeatable. We can look at the scene in my previous video and see how I made some aspects of the tree unique in this type of way, and essentially failed at making a repeatable asset. At this point, it isn't particularly eye-catching, but it's also not repeatable. It is just in a weird state of bad. Next, I want us to talk a bit about platforming trees. These are trees that also act as platforms. I think these can be tricky to implement, but I'll show you 4 different types. We have stumps, we have crown platforms, sort of like this tree that was supposed to hang off a cliff, or this behemoth of a tree, which we were supposed to jump up. Then we have something that I think is tricky to implement well, but something like trying to suggest that you could jump along the branches. This is something that I think is tricky, largely because it is bad at signaling that it is a platform. And lastly, we have an implementation that I've shown many times before, jumping inside the tree. Just to draw something in this case, I'll just draw this small tree with a square crown. Now we're going to draw one more tree and talk about texturing. Once again, we draw a cylindrical shape with balls on the top. I want to add here that making balls on top of the tree can be a good principle, not just because it's easy to do, but also because if you want to start animating our leaves in the future, keeping these balls on separate layers can really aid in implementing that. Similar to how Lost Relic games have implemented his tree animations. We shade a bit. Roughly speaking, I tend to imagine the sun coming from above, and thus the shadows tend to be in the bottom. But since the crown is hanging right above the top of the tree trunk, we shade the top of the trunk as well. Now I go into texturing. Sometimes I start with line art, but quite often it can be good to add some random colors here and there, and then smooth it a bit. And now we add line art on top of the shapes that we accidentally created. Because personally, I find that it can be quite tricky sometimes to convey shape with just line art. So having a shape to work off of can really make it easier. I did this earlier on the crown of this tree. You see, I first tried to do line art directly, But as soon as it was done, I realized it looked awfully artificial, so I splattered a lot of different colors with a textured brush, and then made the land art using the shapes that the textured brush created. And in my opinion, it turned out a lot better. And we're essentially employing the same method here. There are many ways to create bark on a tree. In this case, I'm largely just imagining that we're wrapping the tree in tiny snakes or something. And this type of texturing is so tricky and annoying that I have to go back and forth between color, smudging, and line art. But the basic principle is there. For the previous tree, we also made something quite tricky, which is to imagine that the tree is consisting of tubes, and then we shaded to enhance that illusion. We can also go ultra minimalistic in the rendering of our texture, like here, here, or here. We can break up the bark in order to create interesting textures. We could even go all out and create this weird swirly pattern. A lot of textures can be tried. Some of it works, some of it won't. As a basic principle, I think it could be good to just remember that the trunk is a cylindrical shape, so we will quite often have more textures on the side than in the middle. If we look back at the previous tree, the idea here is that it is a centerpiece. Even though the shape is basic, the texture, contrast, and detail is so unique that it still demands attention. I think it can be worth to point out here that we either want to make something repeatable that adds to the environment, or something that can act as a centerpiece for a scene. If we have a tree that isn't cool enough to be a centerpiece, but also not generic enough to be repeatable, I think we just have a shitty tree. With that said, let's talk about time. So I tried to write down the times it took to draw these trees. I also made this really simple tree to get a better overview. So we have these trees and the time it took to draw them. I would say that I'm fairly efficient at drawing. So if you're a beginner, you could easily spend 5 times as long to draw these trees. I personally would probably never draw this type of tree. It just takes too long. I can't possibly create an entire game in this type of style. Not alone. I would personally land on creating something similar to these type of trees. And in general, I try to cap it at an hour. I have this limitation to some extent because I don't want to have feature creep or art style creep or whatever you would call it. Because the fact is I can draw better than I do. It's just that it would take 10 hours instead of 1. One important caveat here is that once you have established a style and a texture, it can often be quite good to skip the process of redoing stuff from scratch. I'm not doing it in these videos, but I very often cut parts of a previous asset and use it as a base to work off of. And the only reason this asset took me 2.5 hours is because I had to draw it from scratch. Reuse as often as you can. The process that will take you the longest will always be establishing new assets and new styles. But once you know how to make a particular type of asset in a style, it will go much faster. With that said, if you haven't really started creating your assets, I suggest you start by making a really bland tree. And try to establish a style that looks good, but that you could conceivably maintain for an entire game. These type of centerpieces are things to put in YouTube thumbnails or on special occasions like the power-up tree in Ori, but they aren't necessarily good for establishing your scene or level. Lastly, I'll touch on a mistake I made in my last video, and in the process introduce the last type of tree. These are silhouettes. We leave them at that, and they help create depth in your scene. I forgot to make them in my last video, but it is definitely a good thing to add in your game. It adds a lot and takes little time to draw. There's definitely more to cover in this area that I will make videos on in the future, because all of this is also dependent on the type of game you want to make. And the idea of creating a centerpiece can often be trickier than I suggested here, because it isn't always about just making it look pretty, but how it ties into your story. But I will tackle that in a future video. In this video, I just wanted to make you aware of the purpose of the asset you're creating, and that your asset can't be viewed in isolation. You also have to consider time management and the rest of your scene, so that you don't make everything demand attention, because if everything demands attention, you just have a cluttered scene. Boring and bland assets are often more important than the fancy ones. Even if I bashed on some aspects of my previous video on staging, I actually think that this is a really useful video to get a better grasp on how you can place assets in your scene. Because making your scene isn't just about having nice looking assets, as I've tried to establish in this video, but also how those assets interact with each other. So check out this video if you want to see how I approach staging. Thanks for watching. Bye.